You know that specific sound a pair of $500 steel-toed boots makes on polished concrete? It's not just a click, it's a statement. It's that rhythmic thud, thud, thud that says, I've been walking these floors since before you knew what a server rack was, and I'm about to show you exactly how much you don't know. I was standing in the back of the main conference room at Crawford Defense Technologies, holding a cup of coffee that tasted like motor oil mixed with disappointment. Name's Patrick Sullivan. Pat to everyone who's worked with me for the past 22 years. I'm 47, been the director of infrastructure since most of these kids were learning to tie their shoes. That means I knew exactly how much that polished concrete floor cost per square foot, $22.50 installed with the non-slip coating required for defense contractors. I knew the HVAC load needed to keep this glass-walled conference room from turning into a greenhouse in the Texas heat. And I knew that the lease on the coffee machine was expiring in 2 weeks, but apparently none of that mattered anymore. Anthony Crawford, Tony to his frat buddies, swept into the room like a tornado in a $3,000 suit. Kid had that specific glow that only comes from trust funds and zero real-world consequences. He was 29, had a Stanford MBA his daddy probably donated a building for, and had just been appointed CEO after his father, Colonel Henry Crawford, decided to retire to his Montana ranch to find his purpose away from board meetings and quarterly reports. "Morning, team," Tony announced. His voice had that forced energy that makes HR departments nervous. Today marks a new era for Crawford Defense Technologies. We're streamlining operations. We're pivoting to digital-first infrastructure. We're disrupting our own legacy systems. I took a slow sip of my terrible coffee. Streamlining operations is corporate speak for firing anyone who remembers how the backup generators actually work. Before I go any further, let me paint you a picture. Crawford Defense Technologies isn't some Silicon Valley startup. We manufacture aerospace components for military contracts. We're talking precision-machined titanium parts that go into fighter jets, satellite guidance systems, and missile defense platforms. This isn't code you can debug from your laptop. This is hardware that either works perfectly or people die. Tony scanned the room like he was looking for targets, not people. When his eyes landed on me, he smiled. One of those sharp, predatory grins that shows too many teeth. "Pat," he said, and the room went dead silent. You could hear the hum of the security card readers in the hallway. "Step forward, please." I didn't move immediately. I adjusted my reading glasses, smoothed the front of my polo shirt, Crawford Defense logo, faded from years of washing. I walked to the front of the room, work boots making no noise compared to his Italian leather shoes. "Everyone," Tony gestured to me like I was a museum exhibit. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. Legacy systems. Analog thinking. Pat here has been managing our facilities since before smartphones existed, and frankly, we don't need facility managers anymore. We need systems integrators. We need digital natives." He turned to me, dropping the smile. "Pat, consider this your notice, effective immediately. We're outsourcing infrastructure management to a cloud-based firm in San Francisco. They're faster, cheaper, and frankly, they understand modern technology." A murmur went through the crowd. I saw Nicholas Walsh, our general counsel, standing to Tony's right. Nick was a good lawyer, but weak. He was staring at his shoes. He knew this was an age discrimination lawsuit wrapped in a wrongful termination bow, but he was too scared of the new vision to speak up. "You want me to leave now?" I asked. My voice was steady. I don't yell, I analyze the situation and respond accordingly. "Right now," Tony said, checking his Apple Watch. "Security will escort you out. Leave your laptop and access cards. And please don't make a scene. It's very analog." I nodded slowly. I didn't argue. I didn't mention my 22 years of loyalty or the time I came in at 2 a.m. because the primary cooling system failed and I was the only one with the vendor's emergency contact. I simply reached into my work bag. "Very well," I said. "If I'm no longer the director of infrastructure, I suppose I shouldn't be holding on to these." I pulled out a heavy ring of keys, not digital access cards, actual physical keys, master keys, override keys, keys that looked like they belonged in a medieval castle. I placed them gently on the glass podium in front of Tony. The metal made a soft clink on the glass. "The master set," I said quietly. Building access, warehouse, perimeter security, the backup systems, and the executive override protocols. Tony rolled his eyes. Cute. We use digital access cards, Pat. Keep your antiques as a souvenir. But Nick, the lawyer, finally looked up. His eyes locked onto that key ring, specifically the red tag attached to the largest key. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like he'd been bleached. Tony, Nick whispered, and it came out like a strangled sound. Tony, those aren't just facility keys. Hush, Nick, Tony snapped. He waved at security. Get him out of here. Two guards, guys I'd known for years, whose kids played Little League together, stepped forward looking apologetic. Sorry, Mr. Sullivan, one mumbled. It's fine, Pete, I said. You're just doing your job. I turned back to Tony one last time. He was already looking at his phone, bored with his own power play. He had no idea what he'd just done. He thought he was taking out the trash. He didn't realize he was removing the foundation of the entire operation. Good luck with the cloud-based management, I said. I hear the reception is terrible in the basement server rooms. I walked out. I didn't look back. But as the glass doors closed behind me, I saw Nick frantically grabbing the key ring, his hands shaking as he brought it close to read the tag. I knew what it said. I'd written it there myself 14 years ago. Property of Lone Star Holdings. Owner use only. Tony wanted to make a statement about being the new boss. Well, he certainly proved something. He proved you should never fire the person who holds the keys until you know exactly whose locks they open. And he was about to find out that Crawford Defense Technologies didn't actually own the ground he was standing on. I did. To understand why Nick the lawyer looked like he was about to have a heart attack, you need to understand the history of Crawford Defense Technologies. Or rather, you need to understand Colonel Henry Crawford's approach to paperwork, which was to avoid it like the plague. 22 years ago when I started, the company was a chaotic defense contractor operating out of leased warehouses. Colonel Crawford was a brilliant engineer and a terrible businessman. He treated financial regulations like suggestions and viewed contracts as personal insults. He wanted to build aerospace components and collect defense contracts. He did not want to deal with property taxes, zoning compliance, or liability insurance. About 14 years into my time there, Crawford Defense exploded. We were drowning in military contracts and needed to expand. The colonel wanted to buy a massive campus in Austin, 4 buildings, vehicle testing grounds, and secure storage facilities. It was a $42 million acquisition. But the colonel had a problem. His personal credit was tied up in real estate investments, and the company's debt-to-equity ratio was shaky because he kept forgetting to file quarterly reports on time. The banks weren't enthusiastic about lending Crawford Defense the full amount. I was the infrastructure manager back then. I sat in on the meeting where the colonel was having a meltdown, throwing stress balls at a whiteboard because the bank wanted a higher down payment. I don't have time for this bureaucratic nonsense, Colonel Crawford shouted. I need that facility. We have million-dollar contracts sitting in limbo because we don't have secure manufacturing space. Pat, fix it. Fix the bank's lending criteria? I asked, looking up from my notepad. Fix the ownership structure, he yelled. I don't care who owns it, I just need to use it. Set up a shell company, set up a trust. I don't care. Just get the paperwork signed so I can move the equipment in. That was the moment, the golden opportunity. See, the colonel didn't care about assets, he cared about operations. He viewed real estate as a liability, something you had to maintain, insure, and pay taxes on. He wanted the utility of the buildings without the headache of ownership. So I proposed a solution, a strategic holding entity. I created an LLC called Lone Star Holdings. Sounds corporate, vague, and boring, exactly the kind of name that makes eyes glaze over in board meetings. I told the colonel that this entity would purchase the property, hold the liability, and lease it back to Crawford Defense on a triple net basis. This would keep the mortgage off Crawford's balance sheet, improving the company's debt-to-equity ratio for future investors. The colonel didn't even read the proposal. He just heard improved debt ratio and I don't have to sign the mortgage. Brilliant, he said, signing the authorization while eating a breakfast burrito. Make it happen, Pat. Here's the detail that slipped through the cracks. Lone Star Holdings wasn't a subsidiary of Crawford Defense. It was mine. I legally formed the LLC. I put up my own savings and a significant loan from my divorce settlement for the down payment. The bank approved the loan because Crawford Defense signed a 25-year lease agreement that guaranteed the mortgage payments. Essentially, Crawford Defense was paying my mortgage while I built equity. Was it illegal? Absolutely not. It was fully disclosed in the stack of documents the colonel signed. It was right there on page 47. Lone Star Holdings, a Texas limited liability company, sole member Patrick J. Sullivan. The colonel just never read page 47. Neither did Nick Walsh, who was a junior associate at the time and was more focused on passing the bar exam than reviewing title deeds. For 14 years, I played the part of the dedicated employee. I managed the buildings, I fixed the systems, I negotiated the maintenance contracts. And every month, Crawford Defense Technologies wired a massive rent check to Lone Star Holdings. And every month, Lone Star Holdings paid the mortgage and banked the profit. I never flaunted it. I drove a 2018 Ford F-150. I brought my lunch in a cooler. I wore work boots and company polos. I let them treat me like the maintenance guy, the person you call when the air conditioning breaks or the network goes down. I became the landlord they forgot they had. Over time, I expanded the portfolio. When Crawford needed a new R&D facility, Lone Star Holdings bought it and leased it to them. When they needed secure data storage, Lone Star acquired the land and built the facility. By the time Tony stormed in with his digital transformation vision, my little LLC owned the headquarters, the manufacturing facility, the testing grounds, and the secure storage warehouse. I essentially owned the chessboard while they were arguing about the pieces. So when Tony fired me, he didn't just fire an employee. He fired the entity that granted Crawford Defense the legal right to operate on its own property. The best part? The 25-year master lease, the one that kept rent reasonable and terms favorable, had a very specific clause regarding termination of the primary liaison. That liaison was me. I sat in my truck in the parking lot, my parking lot, watching security patrol the perimeter. I pulled up the banking app for Lone Star Holdings on my phone. The balance was healthy, very healthy. Streamline operations, I muttered, watching Tony's silhouette in the executive conference room on the 4th floor. Kid, you just cut the main power line. The thing about infrastructure is that it's invisible until it stops working. And when you fire the person who understands how it all connects, it stops working very quickly. 3 weeks before Tony officially took over, I knew the transition was coming. The rumors had been circulating around the break room for months. The sun is taking charge. Changes are coming. New direction for the company. As a professional who actually cared about operational continuity, I prepared a comprehensive transition document. It was 52 pages long. It covered critical infrastructure dependencies, vendor relationships, and compliance requirements. It was dry, technical, and formatted in Arial 11-point font with single spacing. It was also the most important document in the company's history. I emailed it to Tony, copying his new chief of staff, a 25-year-old named Charlie Price, whose LinkedIn profile listed synergy optimization as a core competency. The subject line was Critical Infrastructure Dependencies and Compliance Framework for Q4 Transition. I tracked the email. Charlie opened it 23 seconds after I sent it. He spent exactly 6 seconds reading it. Then he forwarded it to a folder labeled Legacy Archive. I can picture the conversation. Yo, Tony, the facilities guy sent some massive technical manual about compliance stuff. Delete it. We're going fully agile anyway. We don't need infrastructure frameworks. We need innovation. If they had read page 8, paragraph 3, they would have seen this sentence. Please note that 87% of operational square footage is leased from third-party entity Lone Star Holdings. Master lease agreement is contingent upon continued employment of designated facility liaison, P. Sullivan, to maintain operational standing. Failure to retain liaison triggers immediate renegotiation clause per section 12B. They didn't read it. So 2 days after my dramatic exit, I was at home. My place is a small ranch in the hills outside Austin. Nothing fancy, but it's paid off. I was working on rebuilding a 1967 Mustang engine in my garage when my phone started buzzing. Text notifications from the Crawford Defense internal system. They hadn't cut off my emergency alerts yet. Amateur mistake. Urgent. Access denied. Server room C. Urgent. Environmental system failure. Manufacturing floor. Urgent. Security badge malfunction. Executive wing. I smiled and took a sip of beer. See, the smart building management system that Crawford Defense was so proud of, the one that controlled access, climate, and security monitoring, was registered to the property owner, me. The monthly service fee was auto-charged to my corporate credit card, the one they had canceled immediately upon my termination. When they canceled my card, the payment bounced. The vendor, a company called SecureNet, has a very strict policy. Payment fails, service suspends, immediately. Back at the office, chaos was unfolding. I could picture it perfectly. Tony trying to badge into the executive conference room, getting a red denial light. Charlie trying to access the server room for his digital transformation, finding the magnetic locks engaged and the cooling system offline. And the cooling system. That was the beauty of it all. The system was programmed to default to energy conservation mode when payment authorization failed. Energy conservation means the AC shuts off, the server room fans stop, and the ambient temperature climbs to preserve equipment. In a Texas summer, that means the temperature in the server room hits about 95 degrees within 4 hours. I closed my beer and walked into my house. I opened my laptop, my personal MacBook, not the company-issued brick they made me leave behind. I logged into the Lone Star Holdings portal. There was a message from Nick Walsh. Subject: urgent clarification needed on facility ownership. Pat, we need to talk. There seems to be a misunderstanding about the campus ownership structure. The keys you left don't work on the override systems. Also, the bank is asking questions about a change of control provision in our facility lease. Please call immediately. I closed the laptop. Misunderstanding? I said to my empty kitchen. No, Nick, it's a terrifyingly clear understanding. I decided to grill some steaks. I had all the time in the world. They, on the other hand, were currently sweating through their dress shirts in what was rapidly becoming a very expensive oven. While I was enjoying dinner and watching the sunset over the hill country, Tony was sitting in a conference room that smelled like overheated electronics and nervous sweat. I wasn't there, obviously, but I know exactly what happened because the banker sitting across from him, a guy named Timothy Richardson from First National, plays poker with me every Thursday night. Tony had called an emergency meeting to secure a bridge loan for his digital transformation initiative. He wanted $15 million liquid cash to modernize systems, hire consultants, and launch new product lines. His plan was simple: use the Crawford Defense campus as collateral. The property had appreciated significantly over the past decade. It was worth at least $58 million now. Tim told me the whole story over beers the next week. So, Tim had said, adjusting his glasses, Mr. Crawford, you want to leverage the headquarters at 1247 Defense Park Boulevard as collateral for a $15 million line of credit. Exactly, Tony said, fanning himself with a folder because the air conditioning was still offline. It's our flagship facility, represents the solid foundation of our growth strategy. Tim tapped his tablet, frowned, and tapped it again. Mr. Crawford, there seems to be a discrepancy in our title search. What kind of discrepancy? Tony snapped. The building is right here. We're sitting in it. Physically, yes, Tim said slowly. But according to our records, Crawford Defense Technologies doesn't own this facility. Tony laughed. A sharp, incredulous bark. Don't be ridiculous. My father built this place. I have photos of him at the groundbreaking ceremony. He may have broken ground, Tim said, turning his tablet around to face Tony. But the deed is held by an entity called Lone Star Holdings. And according to the lien search, there's a strict no encumbrance clause. You cannot use this property as collateral because you're the tenant, not the owner. Tony turned to Nick, who was sweating profusely in the corner. Nick, explain this. Nick cleared his throat. Well, Tony, the corporate structure established during the expansion utilized a third-party holding strategy to optimize tax liability and... In English, Nick. We rent the buildings, Tony, Nick squeaked. We don't own them, we just rent them. From whom? Tony demanded. Who is Lone Star Holdings? Is it a subsidiary? Is it Dad? It's not your father, Tim interjected, looking at his file. The managing member is listed as... Let me see. Patrick J. Sullivan. The silence that followed must have been beautiful. I would have paid money to see Tony's face when the realization hit him like a brick to the forehead. The guy he had publicly humiliated, the analog thinker he had fired for being obsolete, was literally his landlord. Patrick, Tony whispered. The facilities guy. Apparently so, Tim said, closing his briefcase. "And since you cannot pledge assets you don't own, I'm afraid this loan application is denied. Furthermore, Mr. Crawford, looking at your lease agreement, there appears to be a management change trigger clause. Have you renegotiated terms since your recent personnel changes?" Tony stared at him blankly. "Because," Tim continued, "if you don't secure a lease extension within 30 days of the management change, the default rate kicks in. Looking at current market values, that would approximately triple your monthly rent from $650,000 to $1.6 million. Tim stood up. "Call me when you have the ownership paperwork sorted. But frankly, Mr. Crawford, if I were you, I'd be less worried about digital transformation and more worried about eviction notices." Back at my ranch, I poured myself another beer and opened my tablet. I checked the security camera feeds, which I still had access to because they were hardwired into the building's proprietary network, not the company's servers. I watched Tony storming out of the conference room, shouting at Nick. I saw Charlie running behind them, frantically typing on his phone. I zoomed in on Nick's face. He looked like a man calculating his unemployment benefits. It was time to send the first official communication. Not an email, not a text message. I drafted a formal notice on Lone Star Holdings letterhead. To Crawford Defense Technologies Executive Team. From Lone Star Holdings Property Management. Notice of Lease Review and Compliance Audit. Dear Tenant, it has come to our attention that the designated facility liaison, P. Sullivan, is no longer employed by your organization as per Section 12B of the Master Lease Agreement. This triggers an immediate compliance review. Please be advised that all facility modifications made without owner approval must be reversed immediately. This includes the installation of collaborative workspace pods in the manufacturing floor, fire code violation, and the removal of safety barriers in the vehicle testing area, OSHA violation. We will be conducting a site inspection Monday at 9 a.m. Please ensure all facility keys are available for review. Additionally, please remit payment for this month's lease penalty fee in the amount of $97,500 due to breach of liaison requirements. Respectfully, Property Management. I printed it on official letterhead, signed it with my best pen, and had it hand-delivered by a process server. Tony wanted to play CEO. Fine. I was about to show him what it means to deal with a landlord who reads the fine print. The desperation that followed was almost painful to watch. Tony tried calling me directly. I let it go to voicemail. He sent Charlie to my ranch. I wasn't home. He even had Nick draft a settlement offer, $500,000 to resolve the misunderstanding. I responded through my attorney. No misunderstanding exists. Standard lease renegotiation procedures apply. By the end of the week, the board called an emergency meeting. Stephen Hartwell, the chairman, drove out to my place personally. Steve's been around long enough to know when a situation has moved beyond damage control into full surrender mode. "Pat," he said, sitting on my porch with a cup of coffee I'd offered him. Tony made a serious error in judgment. "Steve," I replied, "that's like saying the Titanic had a minor navigation issue." He laughed despite himself. "The board wants to discuss terms." "I'm listening." "Your job back? Full severance package. Apology from Tony." "I don't want my job back, Steve. I want equity." The silence stretched for about 10 seconds. "How much equity?" 6% of Crawford Defense Technologies, plus a permanent seat on the board." "That's worth millions, Pat. It's worth less than relocating the entire operation," I said, "and significantly less than bankruptcy proceedings." Steve nodded slowly. "What about Tony?" "The CEO serves at the pleasure of the board," I said, "but I'll be honest with you. I don't sign long-term leases with people who don't understand what they're leasing." The board meeting was scheduled for Monday morning. I walked into that boardroom wearing my best suit and took the seat at the head of the table, the same room where Tony had humiliated me 3 weeks earlier. This time, Tony was the one who looked small. "Gentlemen," Steve began, "we're here to discuss a restructuring proposal from Mr. Sullivan." I slid copies of my proposal across the mahogany table. "Lone Star Holdings will restore standard lease terms and reactivate building management systems. Crawford Defense continues operations without interruption. In exchange, I receive 6% equity and a board seat." "And Tony?" asked Andrew Coleman, the hedge fund representative. "The board will need to determine if current leadership is compatible with long-term operational stability," I said diplomatically. Tony finally spoke up, his voice cracking slightly. "This is extortion. This is business," I replied calmly. You terminated the liaison required by your lease agreement. I'm simply responding to that breach according to the contract your father signed. The vote was unanimous. Tony submitted his resignation that afternoon. The next morning, I parked in the executive space, the one that used to belong to Tony. I walked through the main entrance, past the security desk where Pete nodded respectfully, and rode the elevator to the top floor. In the hallway, I passed Tony carrying a single cardboard box. We stopped and looked at each other. The guy who thought he was the future meeting the guy he thought was the past. You planned this from the beginning, Tony said. I didn't plan anything, Tony, I said gently. I just built a safety net. You're the one who decided to cut the rope. He shifted the box in his arms. You're just maintenance. You're not a visionary. I smiled the same calm smile I'd used for 22 years of facility management. Tony, visionaries come and go. They burn bright, then they burn out. They chase the next big thing and move on to new projects. I gestured to the solid walls around us. But the person who owns the foundation, who understands how everything connects, who keeps the lights on while everyone else is disrupting, that person stays. I pulled out my new access card, black plastic with gold lettering. Patrick Sullivan, board member. Try not to make a scene on your way out, I said. It's very unprofessional. Tony walked past me toward the elevator, his footsteps different now. Not the confident stride of ownership, but the uncertain shuffle of someone who just learned that confidence without competence is just expensive noise. I swiped my card and walked into my new office. Through the windows, I could see the entire Crawford Defense campus spread out below. 4 buildings, testing facilities, secure storage, all of it humming with the quiet efficiency of infrastructure that works because someone understands how to make it work. They say you should never burn bridges. I disagree. Sometimes you don't need to burn the bridge. You just need to remind everyone who owns the toll booth.